I'll call the meeting order and welcome everybody to the February 9th, 2026 Kalispell City Council work session. Can I please get a roll call?
Councillor Walker,
Here.
Councillor Gabrielle,
Here.
Councillor Blank,
Here.
Councillor Dowd,
Here.
Councillor Waterman,
Here.
Councillor Fisher, Councillor Leftridge, Councillor Nunnally,
Here.
Mayor Hunter.
Here. We have one item on the agenda today, the Montana Land Use Plan. Before we get to that, I'm going to open it up to general public comment, just so folks don't have to wait through our potentially long meeting for general comment. So if you have any comment on something other than the Montana Land Use Plan, please step to the mic, state your name, or raise your hand if you're online.
Good evening. My name is Tanya Horn, and excuse me, I'm the Executive Director of the Flathead Warming Center. City Council members, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Today, I have the rare privilege of sharing good news about homelessness, something we don't hear nearly enough. The Flathead Warming Center opens its doors for our 7th winter season on World Homeless Day, which was October 10th. Since that day, we have helped 24 of our guests move into housing and 7 individuals enter treatment. These are real people taking real steps towards stability, and it's happening right here in our community. This progress is the result of extraordinary staff who show up to do some of the hardest work in social services. They meet people on their worst day, often without the resources that most crisis systems rely on. They do it because the need is devastating in our community. This is happening despite the cost of living in our valley, which leaves far too many with nowhere else to go. This is incredible work by incredible staff. All homeless services providers in our community are working extremely hard. At the end of the day, we want the same thing that even our strongest critics want, for people to be off the streets, on a path to safety and stability. We're all working tirelessly toward that shared goal. But as a community, we've spent so much time talking about where we don't want to see homeless individuals in parks, sidewalks, public spaces. We hear that and we agree. None of us want people living outside. So today, I'm asking us to shift the conversation. Let's focus on where people can be to get the help that they need. Let's decide together, because when we create places for people to stabilize, we create pathways for them to move forward. Thank you for celebrating this progress with us and for considering how we can continue building solutions as one community. If you haven't had the opportunity yet, I would love to invite you to come visit the Warming Center to see it firsthand. And another thing I would like to do is also tomorrow I'll send you a video that you can watch. It's like a 7-minute video that will help you get a good idea about a guest, who we serve, a few success stories, also a little bit about our guests' families, but definitely about our services. So I'll send that to you tomorrow and hope you'll take a moment to see that. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Horn. That's wonderful news. Nope. Seeing no further comment, we'll close the general public comment and move on to our single agenda item, Montana Land Use Plan. And before we get started turning this over to staff, just in terms of process, we're obviously going to go through this document chapter by chapter here and provide some suggestions on it. And out of sympathy for staff, they're having to take comments from 9 individuals, 8 or 7, I guess, tonight. But so rather than kind of turning for each comment to see where people are, just if you hear a comment that you object to, kind of speak up, be sure to speak up, and you know, we can have a discussion from there. But if you kind of agree, then let's kind of keep things moving, flowing along. So if everybody's in agreement with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nygren.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, as you recall, on January 26th, we did have a work session on the land use plan where we just broadly went over the entire document. From this point forward, we would like to work through each chapter, and PJ and Donnie will just kind of start and scroll through it. And we are paying attention, we're listening to things you say, and, you know, where we feel like we can make improvements or take the insight, we'll certainly look at making some edits to the document. And we'll be providing kind of a strike draft back into the next work session. That way both the public and the council could see any changes we've made. Hopefully we've caught kind of the idea of what you're portraying. But as the mayor stated as well, if there's anything really big that is like really want it to be in there or not be in there, one or the other, I think getting a general consensus from the council would probably be appropriate on some of those bigger items. Likewise, knowing that, you know, having a majority new council and this document being out there, you know, as we get towards the end, I do think whether it's the land use map or certain things, really looking at having some action items that we could put in the document, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5, that really, that will kind of come out through this process that we can then use as staff to kind of facilitate another planning process moving forward. Essentially what that does is just give staff direction to start working on some additional things. But with that, I'll turn it over to PJ and Donnie for a staff report.
All right, thank you, Mayor, Council. As was stated, we're going to start stepping through the land use plan. I kind of take it, you know, page by page, see what kind of comments we have out there. If there's any questions that you have that we can answer on that. Also, as Jared stated, you know, we try to incorporate some of those comments and edits, and you know, at the next work session, maybe take a look at some of those and kind of keep you updated with where we're at as we keep working through the document. So that being said, just kind of stepping through and kind of showing you how everything is structured here with the initial part. There's a vision statement that we have and just kind of some general language about the history of the area and looking at the, you know, our founding back in the late 1890s, you know, where we're at in terms of population now. And of course, there's a lot more detail on that as you get into the plan itself later on.
And excuse me, do we just interrupt as we were going?
I think
Absolutely.
Since we're starting with the vision statement, I mean, there's just one question that jumped out at me there. I mean, obviously we talk about the economy, which I was excited to get to that chapter. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I had a question there was we use trails in the vision statement, and sometimes, or sorry, we use trails sometimes as pathways. Is that? I mean, is there a distincting difference between a trail and a pathway from land use?
No, not really.
Okay.
I guess when you get into some of the design standards, you know, it can be a difference if you're looking at a bike path versus a sidewalk and what the dimensions of those are. Okay. And whether it's, you know, if it's asphalt or concrete, asphalt bike paths, for example, are 10, but concrete are 8. I think for the purpose of a vision statement, they're somewhat interchangeable.
It's a universal term. I'm just making sure that we're there. That was my one question on the vision statement, because I see throughout the document, would you go sometimes between trails to pathways? So, thank you.
Okay. And as we were talking about, just, you know, jumping back in here, there's just a little bit of background on history. Again, we get into that more detail. You know, where we're looking at 33,000 residents is our current population. But then also kind of acknowledging that during COVID-19, there was quite a bit of growth that came to the city and kind of where we're at in terms of, you know, being one of the leading micropolitan areas in terms of growth in the country. And if I'm scrolling through too fast to read, just let me know. But and again, with this first part here, it's just, again, just a broad vision statement, and not really getting into anything in terms of specifically any type of the plan components.
I know there was some public comment, and I was wondering too, some more background on the native settlement of the area prior to the non-native population moving in. There was a public comment regarding some more history of the Kootenai people and some of those people that settled here prior to us moving in. I don't know if this is the area of the document or that would be better off in the next section maybe, but I feel like we should have something acknowledging their presence here before us.
I think in one of the later chapters here, one that we'd be looking at tonight, there's some detail on that. And I think there's a lot of things like that, as well as, the railroad coming through and just what kind of makes Kalispell what it is. And that's all part of that fabric of what it does. So, acknowledging that is good. It doesn't have a direct relation on the plan itself, but acknowledging that and acknowledging that there's, a very diverse fabric that we have out there that makes up the community is important.
Yeah, I noted that as well. I think the brief history section, just beginning that with kind of the native presence prior to settlement at the beginning of that.
Is it chapter 2?
It's before the chapters. It's just there's a section titled brief history, and it starts with settlement rather than with native
Right,
presence.
and we can step into that, and if you feel that needs to be broadened as we get into there, we could take a look at that as we touch on that. So. Of course, listing out the council members and commission members that we're bringing it together. In terms of the plan itself, this is how we structured it. We've got a number of chapters. You can see, I'll go back there, but all the way through chapter 9. And the reason we structured it this way was really following the statute itself. The statute says you need to hit, existing conditions, housing, local services, and that's how we came through with this. And for most part, most of these chapters, even the subparts kind of followed the subsections in there. So that there was an intent behind what we did with these sections. But in terms of the overall structure, and we touched on this the last session, but existing conditions, population projections, community growth and design is the two main chapters we'll be focusing on tonight. Housing is certainly a full chapter. Local services and facilities, economic development, natural resources, that future land use map, and a lot of what's in here is just kind of describing what those different colors mean on that map. Implementation plan, that's where some of those, we've talked a lot about the housing strategies, that's where those are plugged in, but also just general zoning updates, subdivision regulations, how you update the land use plan, capital improvement plans are all kind of part of that implementation. And then the last chapter is just incorporating existing plans. For example, the West Neighborhood Plan or annexation policies. So we didn't really get into amending any of those. It's just incorporating those existing plans that we have out there. Then that just jumps us into the introduction. Introduction here, at least this first part, talks a lot about Senate Bill 382, Montana Land Use Planning Act, why we're doing the land use plan right now. As it's noted in here, 10 cities fell under this, cities with population over 5,000 and counties with over 70,000 people. Just kind of spelling out the subparts of what that is: public participation, changes in the planning commission, the land use map, certainly zoning code maps and subdivision regulations are part of that overall MALUPA plan too, and are part of the implementation that we do here. Stepping through, it talks about housing affordability, which is really a central component of what we're looking at here. That's really what drove this whole statutory change in the first place. Also acknowledges, in here refers to the dual challenge of fostering economic growth while preserving the natural and cultural heritage that we enjoy here. And this is where we get into some of this brief history of the Kalispell area. And, here we're talking about, when the railroad was first coming through. It does kind of link back to, some of the, where Kalispell, the term comes from, a native term meaning prairie above the lake. But this is certainly a spot where potentially we could expand on some of that, as you had mentioned. And really, this is general history. A lot of this is history that we have in the current growth policy, so it wasn't something we drafted new, but we're incorporating that. And as a side note, that's what we did with a lot of this. Really, is it was a fairly recent growth policy. We adopted it just in 2018, so a lot of that really applied, and so some of this was updating that, making addressing some of the things in more detail like would be required under MALUPA. But the bulk of the document and the framework of the document really is what we've been operating under and what we've been using since 2018. But again, stepping through, it's just some background on the history of the city, and coming up through the 50s and 60s and some of the growth that happened kind of in spurts. And getting up to the end here, you start seeing some of the stuff that we're more familiar with the Spring Prairie Hunt and Ranch development, the Highway 93 bypass, and some of the stuff that we've really seen as the elements of growth over the last few decades. So any questions on that introduction or any comments on that other than maybe with the native background? Okay. So then that jumps us into Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 is where we kind of laid out some of the existing conditions and population projections. And it's kind of forming some of the basis for what we're looking at forward. One of the core components of the land use plan itself is to acknowledge that there's going to be growth, that growth is happening, and really kind of focusing us on how do we accommodate that growth. How do we make sure we've got the infrastructure in place, which is what Chapter 4 is about. How do we do all the things that we need to do to make sure that flows smoothly. But the starting point is looking at the existing conditions, where we're at population-wise and kind of where we think that we're going over the next 20 years, which is another important point here too, is the plan tries to look out 20 years, but it's really something. We know that we're going to have to do updates before we hit 20 years, so we're not setting anything in stone for a 20-year period. Under the statute, well, go ahead.
I guess I should turn this on. So that's my question there, is if I could stop for a minute. It looks like Dustin may have had a similar question. So that's why when I was asking earlier about what our baseline is, so we're 60%, if I understand what you said, about where we're in terms of meeting current needs, if we look at everything that's not necessarily built, but committed to, right? Then what happens if our growth isn't as expansive as we think it is? Is there a way, what's the flexibility for the plan in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility that's embedded within the plan itself, both within the statute and the plan and just how you approach those things in general. So what you're doing is you're trying to make your best estimate today as to what that population growth is going to be and what those needs are. And you're trying to have a 20-year horizon because, you want to be on task for something like that. Within the statute itself, every 5 years, the Planning Commission has to make a formal recommendation to the City Council as to whether or not we should reopen that. And the real basis is, well, has there been something that's been different? I mean, did we completely miss the mark on what our population growth was? We were estimating 2.5. What if it's 0.5? What if it's 10? Where is that at? And if you're off, then you're supposed to reopen that and start reanalyzing that.
You do it in 5-year increment? There's no way to do it earlier than that then?
Well, that's the statutory thing. And then informally, Planning Commission is supposed to look at it more frequently.
Okay.
Within the plan itself, there's a number of places in here that we say that part of our implementation and part of the plan is to continually monitor what's there. So if we're way off, we jump in on that. So for example, with the facilities plans updates, we're doing one right now. We're a couple really right now with water and sewer because we're bringing the plan on in part, but also in part because with the real explosive growth around COVID, we were anticipating that growth just happened a lot faster. So we probably would be doing those facility plan updates anyway, and then those get incorporated into the code. So it's a multi-layer. It's the statute, it's the plan itself, and then just it's good stewardship of that to try to just continually monitor what's there. And at any point in time, the city can initiate something if you see a basis for that, if there's changed circumstances, or again, if you're off target on anything in there. So I think the last time we kind of talked about a little bit of a living document to respond to different things. Sometimes there might be whole new technologies that are out there. but there's a broad range of things that you can kind of anticipate, might not be able to anticipate, but all those things are, and what you bring up is exactly why they're there.
Okay, thanks. And also thanks for giving me the baseline number. That was helpful.
Sure, I'm glad that helped.
And just to tag on that, and just for the record, Mr. Leffridge did email the council with his comments earlier today since he's not able to be here. But one of his suggestions, it makes sense to me, staff's excellent explanation of why we're choosing 2.5%. That makes sense to me, and I think that's wise. But doesn't make sense to maybe have just a little bit in the section where we talk about a lower number and a higher number, maybe project out what that means for housing over the 20-year horizon, and kind of showing those different, like a graph that kind of shows the different numbers, and then saying, but we're selecting the 2.5% for this reason. And so it kind of shows what those options are, and why we went with 2.5.
Yeah, potentially, I think typically you see cities try to target, and same thing when consultants put together those facility plans, they try to target what your best guess, middle of the road plan is, and then if you're off, you revisit that. So I guess the answer I'd have to your question about whether we want to include that, I think part of it is how in depth should that be? If it's just kind of showing what some of those different numbers might be for population growth based on like a 1.5 and a 4% as well, I think that's probably okay. I think how far you take it makes a difference though too, and it becomes like real dollars when you look at that, because we're spending, and a lot of this is covered by pro housing grants, but the facility plan upgrade was close to $1 million. That's based on analyzing what our needs are based on a 2.5% growth rate. So if we want to embed the the low range and the high range and have that carry all the way through, then you're probably adding several $100,000 onto those facility plans, as opposed to monitoring it and then revising it as necessary. So
I think what we could do, we have a history of where it's really fast and really slow. We could almost just project out fast and slow, and then likely what would happen in those scenarios, whether it's infrastructure projects come faster, the capital projects don't change necessarily, but it's how fast they happen, which then can affect water rates and impact fees. But if growth totally slows, how do you continue to facilitate development? So we could, add some bullet points or something about like what a likely scenario would happen given each path if the city were to take one or the other, so that then you were a bit more proactive in how, like the likely outcomes of each one of those. So we could add a bit there for sure.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be too extensive, just something that shows that we've kind of like looked at this, and we are aware, just what you're saying, that we're aware that there's adjustments that could be made in the future based.
this is where we start getting into the population projections here. And part of, and we kind of touched before about where we were looking at with the 2.5%. Historically, when we've done the planning in the city, 2% is usually what we have used, and it's usually been pretty close to that. The couple COVID years were more like 4%. So 2.5 seemed like it was recognizing that maybe there's some accelerated growth there. It's acknowledging that maybe even a little bit more than what our historical rate was, but we didn't necessarily want to over project either. But that's where we were getting all of these numbers as we were coming through. And in this next sentence here, or paragraph here, you can see with the average growth rate of the 2.5%, would be up to 37,700 residents by 2030, 43,000 by 2035, 49,000 by 2040, and then 56,000 by 2045, which would be about 23,386 new residents. And, as this is, again, we're getting into that projection of the housing demand. Average household size, again, when you're looking at the census records with this, is 2.3 persons per household. And that's kind of a good average across the board when you're looking at that. So really, in terms of the methodology of our projections, it was taking that 2.5%, applying it to what our current population is, Then looking at 2.3 people per household and dividing that, and that's where we came up with that number of the 9,500 to 10,000 housing units that are there. In a straight line, that would be upwards of 500 units per year. But any questions on the methodology with that, or concerns with how we got there? So, and later points in here, and Ms. Blank had hinted at it earlier, is that there is a lot of entitlement that we have out there in terms of numbers of housing units. We're over half of the way towards that total. And that's a rough figure. Things phase in over time. Some of these developments take a lot of years to develop out. Some might not even happen, but we certainly have new ones coming through the door. But I do think that it's good to know that there's progress out there in the market for that. And we're not completely fighting upstream and trying to get housing available. One thing that we did note in here that is a little difficult for planning purposes, though, is, and I think it's still important to recognize that sometimes you can get overly focused on, say, a city of Kalispell plan and just draw a box around the city, right? Without acknowledging that we've got two other major cities with Columbia Falls and Whitefish, and what they do impacts us and what we do impacts them. And you got Flathead County around us too. We have an awful lot of people that do not live in the city and don't count towards this population, but come in to use city services. They're on our roads and streets, go to schools and shop here and so forth. And we also have a fairly large seasonal population with tourist traffic that comes through. So, in some ways you almost have a couple different analyses when you're looking at what your housing needs are versus what your infrastructure needs are, because there's a little bit of a difference in how you look at those two in terms of the demand that's on them. This is 1.3 just steps into a little bit more in terms of acreage that might be necessary for that. 1.3.1 talks about infrastructure demands, and I would say we jump into the infrastructure a lot more in chapter 4. That's where you're looking at each one of those specifically, and this is kind of more of a broad background on that. And carrying all through all of these subchapters or subchapters through here. And I think this is one way that we kind of link those later chapters back to the existing conditions throughout it. So setting the baseline as we're looking things later, these subchapters link back to it. So any questions, comments, chapter 1 as we're wrapping up that chapter? Good. Okay. So chapter 2 is community growth and design. And this still contains a lot of background information, different planning context is what we're doing through here. Introductory chapter, again, setting the legal foundation for what we're doing with the Malupa Act. 2.2 gets into some of the background on city planning, just kind of recognizing that it's not a brand new document that comes out here, but it's kind of sprung out of some of these earlier plans. Just in terms of general history, it used to be called a master plan. That was back in the 60s, was replaced with a growth policy in 2003, and now we've got a land use plan. So in some ways, the gist of it is kind of the same. You're planning out the community, kind of setting out what those expectations are, even though the terminology and some of the specifics have changed around a little bit. 2.3 is talking about the land use plan area, and I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit before, and we'll get into this a little bit more with the map itself later on, but there's really like 3 concentric circles almost when you're looking at the city, and the inner part is the actual city limits. That's our true jurisdictional area. When you're looking at it from a planning perspective, that's what we'd have direct jurisdiction over. The annexation boundary is an area around that where it's outside the city, so we don't have zoning authority over it right now, or building code authority or anything else. But it's certainly areas where somebody wants to come in and use city sewer is typically what they want, that it makes sense. It's close to the city, city infrastructure is close enough. It would come in. I think most of you are fairly familiar with that. And then there's the land use planning area, which is the area beyond that. So, the full land use planning area would have the city limits, that annexation area, but would include other areas out there that you're kind of saying really aren't primed for development right now. But if we're looking out 20 years or something, they could potentially grow into that, and it's worth kind of acknowledging what that might look like in terms of the uses that you might expect out there. Running through here, there's a number of different charts and graphs that we have that kind of break out some of the zoning in terms of the percentage of acreage that we have and so forth. For the most part, let's see here. Run through that. I'll twist this. So this is what we did include here too, because this chapter isn't just about housing. It's also about the economic background and so forth. And so this was from 2021 in terms of the information, because that was the most recent that we had. But it's looking at the different census tracts and looking at the number of jobs in different categories as you're coming through. So we wanted to make sure that that was part of what we had here as well. This map was showing the vacant land within the annexation boundary. And this is particularly important because that's a prime area that we're looking at growing. And actually, when you look at it, it's quite a long ways out. Jared, what we were using like 70 years out or something, that you kind of had a steady rate of growth, that you could kind of fit most of that within the annexation area. It's not to meaning that everything should happen in there, but it's certainly a lot of land that would be available and designated in a way that could be used. Within that annexation boundary, we've got 3,871 acres. And then this kind of breaks down where you can see most of that is suburban residential. Kind of zoom in on that a little bit here. Most of that suburban residential with this kind of beige color that's through here, allowing urban residential, which is our higher density, and then other densities that you'd see through there. So if you're focused on housing, there's quite a bit of area that's potentially available for housing within the annexation boundary, and that's part of what the plan needs to show, is that the city has availability for the market to go out and develop those parcels. And then, we broke that down in terms of zoning percentages overall as well. Kind of zoom in a little bit here. So on the left, it's total acres within the city limits, and then acres of vacant land within the city limits. And you can see it's about 8,400 total acres, about 2,400 in vacant land. And it's similar type of a situation. Where you got a really good chunk of area that's really designated for residential type of development, both in terms of total acreage as well as vacant land. But that's what those two pie charts are showing.
PJ, to clarify, that's about 2,500 acres of vacant land already in city limits.
Already in the city limits.
So
yeah.
not in our annexation boundary or our growth boundary, that's in city limits. There's 2,500. So that's one thing that sometimes if you say that you look at the density of Kalispell or something, it may be low, but that's because you haven't factored in the development of these areas that are vacant yet, so.
I mean, that is encouraging. I'm always shocked by that number of how much space we have for growth and development, even within existing city limits. And yeah, I mean, it's an impressive number.
So Jared, could I ask a question on that? Because it came up when I was reading through public comments, or PJ as well, everyone, sorry. And they were talking about, I'm in favor of higher density in the city so we can keep that agricultural exterior. And that was one of the questions that I asked, how do we do that when that's county? Is there a city county planning commission that we could create or something? I just don't quite understand how we respond to that request. I appreciate it, but it seemed,
Yeah, I think one of the main.
I just don't know what to do with it, and I apologize.
Where was the request?
Oh, it was just in a public comment, and if
Oh,
you go
public
through you had the engaged Kalispell, and there were plots, little points, and then if you read the points, they had comments in there. And
So I
it came up enough that I thought, oh, I should ponder that.
No, for sure. I think one of the core policies in our existing growth policy that's really driven a lot of the stuff that we've done over the last 10 years and continues in the land use plan here is that we want to encourage that growth where we already have services primarily, but where some of that development is already there. So you want to get that development happening on sewer. And so one of the things, if you went back to, the 80s, for example, City of Kalispell really looked at us as a utility, and they were very free in giving sewer service, out in the county or anything like that. Sometimes with the expectation that, when the subdivision hit 50% development, we'd annex them in, and that always became kind of a difficult thing to do. I think as we got into the 90s and the early 2000s, the city really kind of took a policy of we want to really encourage annexation. We try to remove, barriers from people not wanting to come into the city. And right now, one of the best things that we can do is we can offer density. And so, you can only get to maybe an acre and a half on septics, but you can get quite a bit more density when you're in the city. And I think that's one of the things that you see in the land use plan here, but something that we've done through PUDs over the last number of years too is to really embrace that density if it's done well, right? So if you accommodate, open space, deal with your stormwater, get them on water and sewer, have functioning roads and everything, we've been really willing to take in density. And when you allow that density to happen in close, and you can prevent that sprawl that's going out. And I think that there's a lot of examples where we've done that 30 or 40 years ago, it may have developed, you might have 100 acres that would have developed into 80 lots out in the county, and that just kind of happened. But through that annexation or approach to annexation that we've done, you see more density happening on that same 100 acres, and that prevents the sprawl from going out. And I think in combination with their annexation boundary, that's where we've tried to hit that policy. So. Okay. And again, we have a number of charts here just kind of breaking down residential use designations, between areas within the city limit, looking at some of those county zoning designations that are outside the city. And just kind of stepping through all those, as well as future land use designations. Just kind of looking at all of that and kind of formulating this basis for how much land do we have available to grow into? How do we meet that housing demand that we were seeing there? So again, it's just baseline information to kind of establish what those findings are later. And again, this is linking up to the future land use map. We're kind of starting to kind of lay the groundwork for what you see there. And so here in the bullet points, you can kind of see where that future land use emphasizes the higher density urban residential areas. Diverse housing choices is a key that kind of keeps, it's a theme that comes through here. We don't necessarily want to focus on just one type on any end, either end of the spectrum, or suburban residential neighborhoods on the fringe to transition into rural lands, certainly using mixed-use centers and corridors that blend housing, retail, and employment.
Does that transition still fit, given what we were just talking about? Like that we would want to encourage more density inside the city so that they don't sprawl out into the county, and let the county be that transition zone and make the city a more, like, this is the city and that's the county. And if you want space, the transition area is the county.
Yeah, and that's a tricky part of what we do in terms of relationship with the county, and especially county residents that come in. It's interesting because where that bar is a matter of perception, right? And when you're used to 5-acre tracts around you, and somebody comes in with 10,000 square foot lots, that seems very high density. If you're used to 7,000 square foot lots like you have in town, 10,000 square foot lots would be oversized, right? It'd be like a lot and a half. But that perception of what you see is important. So you know, I think with a lot of these, you don't necessarily want to swing to one end of the spectrum or another. I don't think you want to say, well, we just always want ultra high density because that's going to be the best of what we're going to have looking as a whole. You want to see how that incorporates into the fabric of the community. You know, whether that's, you know, bumping up to the downtown, you know, we'd have a certain type of character of a development there. Might be a little bit different, you know, if you're kind of coming up and butting up to existing county subdivisions. And I think that that's part of what it's recognizing here is if it was all vacant land that was out there, then you might develop it one way. But when you're developing, you know, 100 acres wedged among, you know, a bunch of 30, 40-year-old county developments, you know, you got to figure out how that blends in. So,
But I think that's different than what's being said, kind of the transition to rural areas on the fringe, and that, or at least the way it would be interpreted, because it's what we've been doing has not been what I think most people would interpret this language to mean. Because, you know, if you look at Silverbrook, which is our fringe, and we just, you know, we approved mixed use and these apartment complexes out there, and then out 3 Mile, we just extended that Spring Creek development, which that was actually one of the issues the neighbors had, was kind of what was in that development, but we approved multifamily apartments. But there was discussion of, like, right next to the houses in the next development, we didn't put, you know, there wasn't apartments right next to it. So I think maybe that's to your point. But I think maybe being clear what this means, so we don't, because I think we even had this quoted to us in one of those meetings from the neighbors saying, you're not being consistent with your growth plan because this says transition to rural areas and you're putting apartments on the edge of town. And to be clear, that this doesn't mean we're not going to put multifamily apartments at the edge of town. It may just mean that, you know, next to a single family home, you know, there's going to be.
right. And I think it's worth clarifying that language in there. But, you know, Silverbrook, I think, is a great example of what you're talking about there, because yes, there is, I mean, there's mixed use, we've got commercial, you've got the higher density, you know, apartments, townhomes and everything. But the whole way that lays out is you've got all that in the northeast corner of that development, right? And so it's kind of near where you've got the intersection. You didn't have any homes directly adjacent to it. Other areas get to be kind of the larger estate kind of thing. So, you know, Tronstead was another example of where that went through. They focused their density on the inside and then had buffers on the outside with the larger lot sizes that were adjacent to the existing homes. So I think we're saying the same thing with what's there, is that, you know, it's not a black and white cookie cutter thing that you're putting in. But we can definitely kind of expand on that language to make it clear about what we mean by a transition there.
Well, the developments in the past that have had the biggest issues have always been when there is a sudden change in density, whether it's up or down, right? And that's something that we really try to avoid when we're looking at, I mean, I don't put a whole bunch of faith or stock in the character of the neighborhood thing, but when you have one neighborhood and the next neighborhood begins and there's a sudden increase or decrease in density, it just doesn't feel like it's a contiguous neighborhood. And I think that's exactly, Tronstead, the first go around, didn't have that buffer zone. And that's one of the things that we were majorly opposed to as a city was, hey, you're kind of surrounded by county and there's all these big family, you know, big lots, and you're coming in there with immediate density. And so they changed their plan. They changed their plan. So some of that was due to our change in zoning, but it ended up being, you know, a decent, much more palatable plan to the neighborhood when the density was not sudden. And I think, I don't know if you want to put that in here or not, but that's really what it boils down to when we come into when they're now it's going to be at the planning commission when they're talking about these, is, you know, as long as it's not like a shocking change between, you know, one street to the next, I think that's basically what we're trying to say in here, as far as the character pieces are called out and the density pieces are called out. But yeah, in some cases, like in the Silverbrook case, there's those multifamily that are out there. There's nothing on the other side. So it would be natural to have the next development put multifamily there and then ease it back into single family on the edges, right? So, I think it'll all work out in the end, but I do understand exactly what you're talking about, but it's the sudden changes that are getting us in a lot of comments.
Yeah. And I think, you know, which I think is understandable, which is people in a single family home don't want to feel like there's somebody in the fourth story apartment looking directly down onto their backyard while they're, you know, playing with the kids or whatever. That idea that, you know, yeah, there's a street that maybe separates the multifamily from the single family, so they're, you know, they're not feeling like it's towering right above them. I mean, that, you know, that makes sense to me, but most people are interpreting this, I think, as saying that all our density is going to be in the inner core and the edges is going to be nothing but single family, and that's not what we're doing, and we shouldn't leave them with that impression with
And
this
then
language.
also, I mean, because of state law and because of this, I mean, by right, people can put that density in. I mean, you can duplex any future developed space could be a proposed duplex, or I mean, so that density is there. I do think that sometimes people go and look at these documents, and this is where you're managing those expectations, so that people have an idea that it could happen.
Right.
I mean, I think that it's nice to be able to say that we're looking for some transition, but the reality is the state law is saying it's by right. It's going to happen. It could happen always. So
Yeah. Suburban definition isn't the same anymore. It's changing, so it's probably a bit of the nomenclature there, but certainly when you have large tracts of land and you have city services, you want to take advantage of being able to provide that density and do a development. It is more about the transition between different uses, knowing that certainly the city needs to, where possible, take advantage of, you know, those large tracts of land for development and getting the density there on city services. So yeah, we'll work on that bullet point.
And I do want to, sorry, I apologize. There's a couple other points I want to make, because I think this question of future land use is something we, you know, should focus on. And maybe it's, I'm thinking maybe this is the right place for this, but, you know, if you think of a better place, that's open to that. But I would like to see a couple paragraphs that just talk about, we have a little bit kind of later on, like touch on it, but just having like a real clear call out paragraph where we talk about the benefits of that compact development for the taxpayer in terms of infrastructure being less costly when you develop more compactly. You're saving the taxpayer money. That maintenance over time is less because you have less sewer and water extensions, less services, you know, police and fire having not go as far distance and so forth, and talk about that benefit, that there's reason why compact development makes sense. So one is the savings to the taxpayer, but also, you know, the health benefits. It's very well documented that more compact walkable communities have tremendous impacts on health savings and people's longevity, and ultimately the cost on your community for medical services and all this stuff. So kind of highlighting in a few paragraphs the value of that more efficient compact development for the community, and just calling it out in kind of specific paragraphs.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we would completely agree with, and kind of tying back into some of the other reasons that we touch base on with preventing some of that sprawl and so forth. I'm not sure if this this subchapter is where we'd put that, but we could certainly expand on that wherever. We'll take a look and see where it might go in best.
Yeah. So, okay. And then I do want to just refer back to Mr. Leffridge's comments, because he had a comment on this section. So that bullet point on mixed-use centers and corridors, and I hope I represent his comments here, but I think he was looking, as we get further into like the goals and policies, to like tie back to that bullet point maybe and expand on that, or identify some bullets or goals or policies that tie back to that bullet point.
Yeah, we can do that too. So I think where we're at was mixed-use centers and something's, there, industrial districts, especially concentrating those in rail accessible areas. There's certainly other areas that you would could have that, but that's kind of where we focused a lot of the energy when it comes to industrial uses.
Maybe like just heavy industrial uses? Does light industrial need rail yard and need that kind of a
It's
concentration?
I2. I mean, it's someone out there. The rail industrial park is focused on rail accessible. And so that was a lot of where it was based on and where the grants came from and so forth. Lighter industrial, because our B5 and I1 are both industrial based type of zones. And, you know, we don't have a ton of that within the city. I think one thing, seeing this is kind of going back to is, you know, I mean, I grew up in the valley, and you can kind of see where different areas of the valley kind of had, you know, Columbia Falls historically was the blue collar area, and you saw a lot of the industry up there with Plum Creek and with the aluminum plant and so forth. And that's kind of changed, you know, in recent years too. And I think that's one reason why we haven't necessarily seen a lot of that. Historically, with the railroad coming through town, I think we had upward of 50 some users not that long ago, and kind of whittled down to just the 3 or whatever it was when we relocated out on the eastern side of town. So it's not really excluding industrial uses, and we have a couple different categories that are out there. But partly because of where we're at with the rail park and kind of removing the railroad that kind of formed the basis for some of that industrial area, I think that was why that came in there as being concentrated there. And I think the key term is concentrated. It's not exclusively concentrated, but that's an area that you would want to focus some of those uses. So,
Expand on that, because I believe under the economy chapter there is, because that is one thing we know moving forward, especially with chips and stuff and the manufacturing of that, and the importance of tax base for the city of Kalispell and having a diverse tax base and having industry in the city, say, rather than the county on septics and things, but more importantly, just for the tax base, because it helps, it diversifies it. Probably should add something more on the lines of light industry as well, and planning for that, because it's in the future, and certainly trying to encourage that into the city when possible, I think would be a good.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that. I'd like
Yeah.
to try to encourage more of that diverse kind of industry as opposed to just the heavy industry stuff.
So I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but since we're
Since I opened the door.
since we're on industrial stuff, data centers, a lot in the news about data centers. I haven't heard anything about coming to the Flathead. I hope I don't. The reporting about the energy use and the water use of these things is just like shocking. It's shocking. It's like data centers that use as much power as New York City, the entire city. I mean, it's incredible. Obviously, we don't have the capacity to handle that, but so I don't think we need to deal with it right now. But just on our radar, that if we ever get hints that, you know, these companies are looking at the Flathead for data centers, that we want to get ahead of that before we have a problem.
right. And I don't have the specific language in front of me, but there was some legislative bills that went through that gave protection to that type of use.
Oh, really?
So,
Oh, okay.
so yeah, limited amount of what you could do with that.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't have it.
Yeah, I believe that there's been some legislation about it, and part of that is that definitely the co-op also watches it. Just, limited amount of use that we have here, so I know that they've taken concern about the same issue, just making sure we have the capacity and where that would be within, and if it would be.
So what would that look like? Because I mean, Butte's getting 2 right now, right?
I'm not sure what they're
Yeah,
in.
yeah, there are 2 data centers going in Butte. So
I think essentially what you need to do, the way that I recall how that statute would be set up, is you'd basically treat it like any other light industrial type of use, because there was a lot of opposition based on what the mayor was indicating there. And I'm just guessing that there was probably some blowback from the legislature with that, but there's definitely some legislative bills that address that exact use.
And they did pass, so
Yes.
they are.
Yeah.
Okay. Our wisdom of our state legislature.
There's more than one bill that came through that had certain things that they were targeting like
Yeah,
that.
I wouldn't mind if you know, wouldn't mind send me the link so I can read the language. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, we're not probably gonna get anytime soon because the land around here is way too expensive. And that's why Butte and Billings are getting them, because the land's a lot cheaper there. I will also caution that a lot of the fear around these is generated by the media.
Yeah.
I work in the industry. I understand, kind of how some of these big data centers are put together, and they wouldn't come out here if there wasn't plenty of electricity, plenty of land, and their heating. I mean, so their cooling systems are really expensive to put in. So I think we're safe in the near term. It could change depending on what happens with our land prices, but if we continue to be like a resort area, it's going to be very unlikely that they're going to be attracted to this place. But we have similar kind of stuff with some of our tech companies around here. They're using a lot of power. But
I'm more worried about the water use.
What's that?
So I'm more worried about the water usage of data
Same.
centers and stuff. The cooling, they use a ton of water.
Yes, they do.
If it's water cooled, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of them are
And not a closed system.
what's that?
And not a closed system.
That was gonna be my question. It's not closed.
Not always.
Yeah, well,
The efficient ones, the,
that's definitely something we can look at in the planning part of this, right? If something ever gets proposed, but we don't want to do anything too harsh to keep like smaller tech entities from coming here, right?
Right.
I do understand the concerns, but I've worked in a lot of those data centers in my past life, and nothing on the scale what we're seeing now, because AI is changing everything, right? But I think we're safe for a little while, and they would probably build another 2 around Butte or buildings and think about coming up here just because of the cost. And our electricity is not as sound as it is in those places. A lot of ours is hydroelectric, and you've seen what happened this last year with our power. It's not as sturdy as we want it to be. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
but I think it is good to keep that in mind. Because BPA doesn't make much money off of power. They make it off of dark fiber. And it's a huge dark fiber pipe that goes from up by Columbia Falls all the way to the Dalles, Oregon. And if you know data centers, that's Google, Facebook, all the major ones are in the Dalles. So it's close enough, right? It wouldn't take much for somebody to put those two things together. So I think it's good to have those. What does that look like?
I mean, ultimately, if we did address it, I'd be focused less on, like you say, talking about data centers and more talking about any industry that consumes like a certain amount of energy, certain amount of water. Like it'd be focused on those impacts rather than the type of industry or what they're doing. It's like if you come in and you use more power than the entire city of Kalispell,
We have a problem.
we're gonna have to take a look at it. I
don't care what you're doing.
Yeah.
Well, the other part of this is they're probably not looking to build within the city. If they were to build in the area, they'd be in the county just because it's going to be vastly cheaper. But yeah, as far as the water consumption and the power consumption is concerned, we should keep our eyes out there and see what's being brought in here. But I put us in a very low percentile of danger in that area just because of where we live.
Sorry, to open that Pandora's box.
Big picture, the thing is, that's why having the growth boundary and the annexation boundary and all that makes sense, because if something is getting close, the city and the council will have the ability to make those decisions and analyze those things, whereas if you didn't have that, then it could just show up one day, so.
Yeah.
Okay,
We
so-
also don't have the service industry pool that would be needed for that, and the housing for employees. So.
They don't employ much though.
What?
They don't employ
No,
many
that
people.
AI. Who needs employees?
There's still the couple of guys with ponytails walking around back there fixing servers. So.
Okay, so then jumping back in, we just touched
Thanks
base on
for focusing
industrial
us back.
districts. Making sure that, public and quasi-public uses, schools and government facilities, parks are distributed throughout the community. That's important. And, getting into the walkability, certainly when you're talking about parks and schools and so forth with that. But then also, incorporating open space, greenways, and conservation areas. conservation easements is something that we've called out in here as a tool that's available for trying to preserve some of the sensitive areas that are out there. Kind of touched on it earlier, but annexation and county coordination. That's, I think, an important part of how we grow. I would say that there's probably more coordination than there seems to be on the surface. When you're looking at that, there's actually 2 referrals that I just got today from the county about some zone changes that were going on, and we'll comment on one of them. But anyway, that's an important aspect of how we grow because of that interface between the rural and the city, and really should be a two-way street too. I mean, we should be looking at respecting as we're going into the county area, and then they should be acknowledging what our growth needs are as we're going out too. And certainly, like one real world example of that is you look at, say, like the issues we had with sidewalks and 2 Mile Drive. Trying to foster things out there that can encourage that, transition to go a little bit more smoothly as areas become more urbanized. So this next section here, and a lot of what we have in the land use plan itself is kind of built around this issues, goals, policies, and recommendations as you're kind of coming through. And that's historically how we've done a lot of this here is, initially kind of calling out, what do we see as issues out there? And you can kind of see the ones that we have in here. Rapid growth followed by slowdowns, growth bringing prosperity, but also certainly straining infrastructure and kind of the resultant impacts on quality of life. Differences between city and county regulations definitely make it a difficult thing at the urban fringe, and I think that makes it frustrating for the community too when there's those differences that are out there. This kind of touches on the low density fringe development, making service extensions costly and efficient. So kind of those benefits of having development happen close in to where facilities are already available, and then trying to avoid highway strip development. That steps you down into goals. That's where you'd see residential and commercial development complementing walkable and bikeable areas, integrating new development into the surrounding neighborhood, and de-emphasizing large parking lots adjacent to street or highway, and making the building more of a prominent feature.
I really like those, by the way.
I
Those
thought
really
you
jumped
might.
out at me. I really like those.
Having a comprehensive, effective growth management program. You want to balance the general welfare of the community as well as individual rights, because that's still a stream through this. I mean, we're sitting here talking about how we want the city to grow, but still underlying that is private property rights, which is an equally important component to what's going on. This is something we rely on quite a bit when we're looking at these different housing projects, is encouraging housing types that provide housing for all sectors and income levels within the community. I think that's something that council has really acknowledged as we've moved through. I think we tend to look at the, how it's developing, how the infrastructure can serve that, and less focused is lower end development, higher end development, and just recognizing that we want inventory, and inventory helps.
May I ask one more question? This is a bit like Orion. I wasn't planning to bring it up, but and maybe this isn't the right chapter, but also when engaged Kalispell, there were a lot of questions about dark sky and how we create development that has that complements the Glacier National Park dark sky designation. Mm-hmm. Is there any place for that in here, or where would that go?
I think one thing is we did adopt the dark sky ordinance. So it's in the zoning ordinance. There's a chapter on outdoor lighting, and it requires shielded fixtures. Basically, you can't shine up or out. Actually, it was one of the stronger zoning measures that we took because it was retroactive.
So how about the Ford? Because that's what they brought up, the Ford dealership.
Yeah, people have talked about the Ford dealership a lot over the years, and I think that
doesn't apply to them then, or
no, it does. And I think that one of the things is dark skies doesn't mean that you're not going to see any light there at all. And part of it is when we adopted that, there wasn't a maximum on site, there was a maximum off site, and it was designed to reduce like the direct glare if you're going to get like something shining straight at you. I think and up, yeah. It was about both of those. It was about light trespass and just kind of the waste that comes from shining straight up into the sky.
And where is that? Just, sorry, I missed that.
It's one of the chapters in the zoning ordinance. It's in
Zoning
there.
ordinance, okay. I'll
I
look
think
and see.
that with the Ford dealership specifically, there wasn't anything up there. It was a big open field. And when that went in and it lit it up, it was like people were used to that just being dark all the way through, and any amount of light was just way different, right? But they were all compliant fixtures, and we had maximum heights on poles. They can't be more than 25 feet tall. But part of what you see there too is that that site is elevated above the highway, and so they get elevated higher than what you normally have. But it's not based on the adjacent street elevation. It's based on grade below that.
Part of that too was that was about the time everybody was switching to LEDs, so that's LEDs, the light is just much brighter.
Okay.
So I guess in general, we have a dark sky ordinance, it's shielded, so the light's not going into the sky, it's
Going
shining
down to
down.
us.
There are higher standards and cities have gone that route, I think like Tucson and things
Well, I
like
lived in
that.
Flagstaff for 2 years,
Yeah,
so
so
that's
there's
probably what I'm
cities-
using as my
It could
referent.
be with the
Yeah.
Council direct, there is higher standards
Yeah.
out there. We do have a dark sky ordinance and it's compliant to a certain extent. Like I said, everything is shielded down, everything has to be on the property, there's no light trespass. But yeah,
that's
the
helpful to
council would have to
understand that.
adopt
Okay.
tighter standards really beyond what we have now. So,
Aren't we
think there's
kind of
been-
like, are we kind of like boxed in a little bit with the lighting anyway? Because don't all the the development lights have to come from Flat Electric, and there's only a few models, right?
to a certain extent, yeah, the street lights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are pretty minimal and, versus some of the larger commercial developments and things like that, but.
We can restrict the number of lights on a parking lot or something. Like, at least at night, maybe like turn off half your lights.
Well, you could, and so there were competing interests when that came through because some people were also concerned about security too, because there's reasons to have lights there. Building code requires that you light up to 1 foot candle for your egress route out of a building into the public way. So you don't want to have too little light that comes through there. So what we tried to do with that was really strike that balance where it was shielded. We had commercial development would have a photometric line that would show no more than 1 foot candle at the property line, but we didn't put maximums on site per se. So, but Jared explained it where you're trying to knock that down and have shielded fixtures. The newer fixtures actually work better. With the newer type of fixtures, they tend to be up in those boxes as opposed to the old mercury vapor lights or something like that.
So as far as this document, it would be, is there support for even a higher night, like, there's just like a senior community or whatever, at a urban forestry community, like, there's night sky things, and if that's something the council wanted to strive towards, like, this would be a document you would put it in, right? And then the devil's in the details with the ordinance and what that looks like. Would be a lot of regulations that would go along with it. Is it retroactive? Is it not? And those types of things. But that would come later. But if
Be hesitant to implement anything that has the tendency to raise prices for units, because that gets passed directly onto the citizens, right? Obviously, there's some of this that we could probably look at that may not affect housing prices, but I just want to. You're going to hear this every time we talk about any change in regulation. First off, I'm resistant to adding any regulations at all, but more resistant to when I know it's going to affect housing prices.
It might also lower them though. If you're doing fewer lights or less intense lights, it could even be, less cost for.
It could be. It's very unusual when government makes a regulation that it brings down.
like I
the
said,
price of any-
this document wouldn't create a regulation, but if we're certainly hearing you, if it's if it's something that the council feels like a good goal to strive towards, you could put it in here, and then
Ms. Gabriel.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just spent 2.5 months in Scottsdale and Phoenix, where they have a very low light situation, and I couldn't find anything. it's dark at 4:30, 5 o'clock, and you can't find anything. People don't have street lights. My Uber driver drove right by me when I had to catch a flight back at dark. So while I understand the conversation and I'm more than happy to discuss it, I want to be real careful that we're not doing such a complete 180 where we're turning our, streets into very, very dark areas where people are concerned with safety and trying to find houses. Does that make sense? I just don't want to go so far the other way.
Yeah.
And if I can, sorry, Carrie, are you done?
Yep.
Okay. You hit on the part that I was concerned about. I'm with you, Sid and Carrie, that tonight on my way here, in fact, coming up Grandview at the college, you could not see the person walking across the street, and they were walking right under the street lights because we've made them so dark skies. And luckily, the guy turning stopped just in time. So I do have some concerns with safety wise of making it too much more restrictive than what it is. So.
Let's see here, where were we at with the, commercial and residential development being designed to take advantage of enhanced streets, parks, and natural features. Maintaining design standards and the highway entrances to the city. Reinforcing major strengths of the downtown, including central location, density, the mix of uses, the historical aspect, really being the seat of government and so forth. And that kind of flows into policies, encouraging resolution of disputes with broad participation and trying to create mechanisms for that. Encouraging consistent government policies and for development infrastructure in urban areas. Provide for land use changes that are complementary to well-established residential areas. Designing and locating, development, protect public health and safety. Development by the public sector complying with the same standards and rules as private sector development. Public-private partnerships being considered when they're appropriate. Certainly want to encourage the design of urban public spaces, streets, plazas, public squares, and so forth. Encouraging design of streets to provide for convenient circulation and safe pedestrian access. Encouraging deployment of cutting-edge information technology infrastructure to try to encourage additional residents and businesses coming into the area, and highway entrances to the city being developed as attractive gateways. As far as recommendations, we'd want to
Just to touch on my comment from the previous meeting, the generous setbacks. Just want to highlight that. We'll maybe come back to that discussion at some point later in the document, but want to highlight that it's there.
Okay. As far as recommendations, this kind of goes in the annexation, kind of in conjunction with water, sewer, storm drainage, and facility. We'd want to make sure that we have things in place to encourage that annexation, so it goes back to encouraging that development and preventing the sprawl. And that's also linked in with the potential utility service area plan, as indicated in the document drawn from facility plan as a guide. Item 3, and we touched on this earlier, but continually to monitoring, updating, and streamlining development codes, keeping abreast of changing trends like technologies. I think that applies to all of our regulations as well as the plan itself. Encouraging infill housing.
On that one, on the infill, I know it's probably just kind of listing examples with cottage apartments and accessory dwellings, but obviously with the change in the with the requirements of the 5 we have to adopt, we're doing more, we're doing duplexes, we're doing, more than that. So I just want to make sure that people aren't going to read this and say infill development only includes, garage apartments and accessory dwelling units, that it can be more than that in terms of what infill means.
Yeah, certainly with that, but yeah.
I don't know if there's another way to word that to make that clear, but
No, yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's other types of housing types, and especially if we adopt the housing strategies that are in there, duplexes or
You could just put for instance in front of that and
you're right.
it
Yeah,
fixes
yeah.
it.
yeah.
For example.
That's all I'm looking for.
Yep. So when you have larger scale developments, you'd want to have studies such as traffic impact studies and so forth, which we do on a routine basis. Certainly want to keep an eye on zoning district designations to make sure that they are in line with the land use plan, and whether it's the city or neighborhoods, or it's always a situation where you can potentially initiate zone changes to bring them into compliance. Maintaining design standards for highway entrances, encourage design standards for commercial projects, and monitor signs as far as standards and policies go. And that takes us through chapter 2, which was kind of the goal for tonight. So any more comments or questions on chapter 2 or anything else that we covered this evening? So
Do we want to look at chapter 3, or it's a little past 8? I don't have too much for chapter 3. I don't know if others do. but
What
we
is
might-
chapter 3 again?
Housing.
Okay.
I think it's largely good, so I don't know if we want to just power through that to get a little extra.
yeah,
I'm
okay.
good for one more
I'm
chapter.
going to have to leave. I've got to go pick up my daughter,
Okay.
but yeah, I'm
You're
okay. If you
with
guys want to
moving it?
move forward with 3, I might have some comments for next meeting, but
In general,
Okay.
I don't have too many comments on 3, so I'm happy
Okay.
to go through for it.
No, we'll have that once we're finished here. Yeah, I apologize. I wanted to get through the discussion.
okay. Okay, so rolling right into it, chapter 3 is housing, and as I mentioned before, that's one of the driving forces behind the Montana Land Use Plan and why it came into existence was really seeing that as a statewide basis. It's certainly nothing that's unique to Kalispell or Flathead Valley, and it's not unique to Montana either. But again, that's the gist of everything that's kind of coming through here. 3.2 is looking at some of the existing housing stock. There's about 19,000 in the greater urban area and 12,000 within the city limits. That's kind of reflecting what I talked about earlier, where we have a fair number of people that are kind of functionally part of the city but aren't city residents or living in the city per se. There's information in here about the age of the housing stock and just some general statistics along those lines. We include some maps showing the different housing types as far as improved properties, unimproved properties, so forth. Overall land use, which of course this incorporates schools, churches, healthcare, industrial, and other things along with it too, but kind of showing the distribution of actual land use out in the community. It's calling out some of the commercial housing. It's kind of hard to see with this without zooming in too much, but showing if you're looking at 1 to 4 family apartment condos, that's what we would consider commercial housing as opposed to single family.
1 second, and just so you're aware as well as the viewing public, we do have these maps in a much larger version to read. Obviously, when you're putting it in an 8.5 by 11, it gets pretty shrunk down, but we do have these available to anybody that may need to see it at a little closer level.
Right.
And the boundary shown on that is the growth area?
Yes.
Okay. On all of them, it's the growth area that we've seen.
Yeah, and that's not changing with the growth policy boundary between the existing and going towards the land use plan. That boundary wasn't changing at all.
Yeah, I probably missed it somewhere on the map, but I didn't see what that border was.
Yeah.
There was just in some of the maps a mistake where it was labeled as growth policy boundary, but it
That's
was
where
actually
my
the
confusion came
annexation.
from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we
Later on.
changed that in most. I think we maybe missed it on this one here, but we went back and changed that on most of those. And just as an aside on that, this does kind of include areas that aren't shown on our land use map, but are included within the West Valley or the Kalispell West neighborhood plan. So it's shown within our growth policy boundary area. So, 3.3 is getting into some of the housing market dynamics and affordability, kind of looking at that median home value, where in 2000 it was 123,000, went up to 352 in 2020, and in 2025 was 574. So you've definitely seen an increase there. It is important to note, though, that that's actually a reduction from 2022 that's gone down for whatever reason, whether it's added inventory we've had in the city or just the fluctuations of the market. There has been a significant decrease in what the median home price was in the city of Kalispell over the last few years. Includes some information on rentals, and then a table showing some of the housing costs as you're kind of seeing through there, both in terms of median home value, value to income, and median rent. And again, more information on median sales prices, average sales price, and number of sales. It kind of links back into that population growth and housing demand, so you can kind of see how the overall layout of this plan is kind of looking at those baselines, then kind of almost where you use findings of fact to make conclusions later on. It's kind of how you kind of step through this. And again, a number of charts with the population and projected housing units in the city.
That's a scary graph.
2,000.
Scary graph. We'll widen it out so it flattens and it's not so scary. And we included information here with vacant land capacity by zoning, and just kind of looking at some of the density that might be available there, and potential number of units that you might see as you were kind of coming through. The main conclusion, and we kind of hit on this, where we looked at the number of, especially when you look at the number of entitled units, but when you look at the vacant land that we have, with both within the city limits and within our annexation boundary, and certainly in a much longer range horizon within the planning area, I think that you can show that we have sufficient land and sufficient zoning designations and growth policy designations to support the housing growth that we need to see over the next 20 years. And that's a really important conclusion as you're looking at this, something that's required under the statute, and we certainly wanted to include that in here. And then that jumps down to the conclusion, which is essentially just kind of what we stated with that.
I had one quibble back there, just top of that page, that mixed use in the core area. Why, is there a reason we should limit it to the core area? I feel like we should just have mixed use in general.
I agree with that.
Will provide more housing.
Where is that at?
The top of that page. Right
It's
there.
this right at the top of that there. You could, and I know that there were some discussions the last time, so I'm not sure where everybody on council is with that, but we can, change that to say where appropriate or something, and kind of leave it open a little bit to what the interpretation is.
Well, actually, it's the word redevelopment there that is important. So we're talking about taking what we have here, redeveloping it into mixed use in the core area.
Yeah.
I think that's an important statement, actually. You could add more to it by saying we encourage mixed use development everywhere, right?
And wherever appropriate, or wherever else it might be appropriate.
Yeah, but I think it's a redevelopment instead of development there that makes this a powerful statement.
Fair.
Right.
Yeah, maybe just clarifying that, because I think I misread it as well, of just mixed use is development is only going to occur in the core area, and I definitely wouldn't want to make that statement.
There's
but I
been
see your
very
point.
few stuff, plans that we've seen over the last couple of years that haven't been mixed
Right.
use, right? I
Right.
mean, that's kind of the trend.
Yeah. I just want to make sure people don't take the wrong impression.
Sure.
but- Yeah.
Maybe put a big RE in front of that.
Yeah. Capital R.
Highlight, underline.
Good call.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sid.
Yeah, thanks. Sid.
And that took us in the conclusion there. There was some additional information here. You can kind of see the distribution of median household income. And this was taken out of census information. And that gets you through chapter 3. So it's into chapter 4.
Read Dustin's comments.
Yeah, well, Dustin had a few comments. one, just inserting maybe a table that kind of talks about different housing types. He might have to elaborate on some of these. I'm not entirely sure where he was going, but something about another table on housing types. There's a comment about kind of different housing types and what's appropriate by right by. Yeah, and then kind of talking a little bit about parking, but I know parking comes later in some of the other chapters, so I don't know if this is the best place to talk about that. But anyways, I don't know if anybody reviewed that, but
He might need to clarify them, but I mean, the parking, he cites that it is also brought up in another spot. I guess the only thing, and again, I didn't have too many comments about this, except for it does seem like a space that, why housing studies are really important. I mean, if we don't have some regular housing studies, I think we've had some discussion of needing to make sure that we have some. This is a chapter that should be inserted into, just because like some of this data gets just older, and it's helpful to know what we actually have out in the field and what's not. But
So,
like
something else that's brought up somewhere else, but
a call
Yeah.
out of saying
Current inventory.
specifically that we should have a practice of updating housing
that's,
studies.
I mean, this was the first spot where I would just like, oh, definitely why we might want to be able to cite that housing studies are important and something that we would want to utilize.
And
I know it is also, like, you're jumping up to the.
I
edge,
jumped
'cause
right up here
The heart
because
of
I
the
said
conversation
we've got
in
it right
general is
there.
down in 8 and 9 anyway, so.
yeah, but it is, actually, we specifically put that in there, because we'd want to have, as you can see right here in chapter 8.2, that further analysis and planning based on a housing study should be conducted with a potential update to the plan depending upon the results of the study. I think one of the important things to know with that too is, we've talked about the pro-housing grant that was awarded to the state a year ago, but we still don't have all the details on how that's filtering down to the city, or to the cities. Needs to be expended by the end of the year. And most of our share is going towards the facility plans update, but we had a segment that was going towards this housing study. So we'd want to do that this year, but we still need to kind of have it filtered from HUD down to Department of Commerce through League of Cities to us as to how we're going to approach that. So.
No. I mean, again, this chapter just really brings up, it's helpful to have the studies so that we know what we're working with.
Yeah.
And especially as we are a growing city. If we're not doing those studies, then we're really shooting in the dark.
And maybe this is in there somewhere, but just the fact that, we'll be reaching entitlement city status by 2040, and that comes with housing funds that will be helpful for the city in terms of meeting housing needs. Is
Yeah,
there
in
a
terms of
reference to that?
infrastructure and a number of things for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should probably add that in there just in general, because the city, we need to be planning for when we're an entitlement city so we can be ahead of the curve. Because oftentimes, I know we talked about, I believe Bozeman ended up being away behind by the time they fully implemented it. Because it's not just housing, it's transportation and everything. And I think at the beginning, it did show that by 2040, we're going to be there. So we probably should have something in here about what that process may look like and how we should plan for that. So
And that's
we'll-
the 50,000 population mark.
Yeah, should there be like a population trigger point at which we start taking that seriously, like when we hit 40,000 people or something?
It's hard because we're actually there.
Wait, if we count Evergreen?
So, like I said, that took us up through chapter 3. So, is there any?
No, I think that was good.
I'd like to hear more about what Dustin wanted with that housing table, but I'm kind of excited about it too because I want to see everything from a mansion down to a studio apartment to a tiny home on that list, right? But we also have to make sure that we mentioned that those aren't the only housing types that are ever going to be available.
Okay. All right. Great job. Thank you.
All right, sure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah, so we'll open up to public comment on this item. If anyone wishes to address the council, please step to the mic and state your name or raise your hand online.
Hope I could read this. My name is Carol Jorgensen. I'm a conservation member and board member of the Flathead Audubon Society, and I'm speaking on behalf of our president, Darcy Thomas. We have over 500 members and many more who participate in Audubon activities. We appreciate the opportunity to comment on the proposed growth policy. We provided detailed written comments on April 24th, 2025. We resubmitted those comments on February 3rd, 2026. I will highlight the key features of our written comments and provide justification for the guidelines that will help maintain the incredible living conditions of Kalispell for people and the organisms that we share the city with. In our detailed written comments, we emphasize the importance of the area's natural environment. The natural environment is essential to the character, resiliency, and livability of our community and should be fully integrated throughout the plan. A standalone chapter on natural environment is meaningless unless it is clearly integrated into other parts of the document to ensure developers know when and where they need to be aware of these conditions and consider various options. For example, the vision statement could include a simple addition such as recreation access to public areas, the incredible views, and the important functions of the natural environment are maintained. The environmentally sensitive resource map, figure 3, shows 100-year floodplain, wetlands, hydric soils, and steep slopes, but it lacks any wildlife information such as big game habitat, wildlife connectivity, and unique places such as a staging area for sandhill cranes. It fails to indicate the importance of the Flathead River and its tributaries to maintaining Flathead Lake's water quality. The document should incorporate the more unique and critical ecological information across the planning area. This information can be obtained from state and federal agencies. Once lost or destroyed, some of these unique ecological areas and the services they provide cannot be restored or replaced. We need to provide sustainable homes for our people, but concurrently we need to provide sustainable living conditions for the organisms that share our living space. Birds, insects, plants, fish, and other organisms continually work for us by providing food, pollinating crops, orchards, gardens, help reduce the effects of insect populations, clean up detritus and dead things, and provide us with song, inspiration, and psychological support. And if we provide simple habitat, they provide these services for free. A study in Conservation Magazine found a positive correlation in the number of bird species in a neighborhood and the median value of houses sold, increasing values up to $30,000 in a bird-friendly neighborhood. Montana bird watchers spend around $260 million annually on the interests of birds and over $600 million and 4,000 full and part-time jobs to Montana's economy. The 2022 World Wildlife Living Planet Index shows a 73% decline in the size of monitored populations since 1970. North American bird populations have plummeted by over 3 billion birds during the same time frame. Urban areas support as many as 20% of bird populations. Guidance to provide riparian areas, avoid and reduce light and noise pollution, provide green spaces, maintain buffers and movement corridors using native vegetation can be incorporated throughout the document at minimum cost to developers or residents. These conditions can also help the human environment, reduce water use, and help maintain conditions that make Kalispell special. We encourage the council to incorporate by reference materials from the Living in the Flathead, which provides proactive guidance for residents and developers about living here regarding fire, wildlife, and water. Environmental and living conditions change often in unpredictable ways. Even the best planning document will need to respond to these changes. We recommend updates to various chapters and subsections to better integrate natural environmental values as new information becomes available. We encourage incorporation of Montana Fish and Wildlife Parks recommendation for subdivisions and development compiled by Montana professionals. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment on the proposed growth policy. We hope you'll incorporate these needed revisions to give the document more sustainability, depth, balance, and credibility. We would be happy to participate in any future updates. And we'd be happy to work with you on the dark sky initiatives that are both safe for people and other organisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jorgensen. You want to know Okay, I'll close public comment and turn to Mr. Nygren for city manager report.
Yeah. Mayor Kaiser, remind, we do have a meeting next week, and it is on Tuesday. It's President's Day on Monday. So next Tuesday, do have a number of things on the agenda, but I suspect it won't be a lengthy meeting. So I actually do intend on holding a work session immediately after the meeting. That way we can continue to move this forward. So on the agenda, you'll see basically opening the meeting, public hearing, closing the meeting, and then going into a work session after that. Similarly, how we do it at the Planning Commission. What was that? Yeah, exactly. We'll plan on doing another 2 chapters at the next meeting. Like I said, just get through it, looking at the timeline and making sure that we're progressing on that. Also, thank you for the comments. We will work on a strike draft and make sure we include that in the packet. That way the public can see any changes we've had and make sure we're trying to incorporate all those comments. And that's all I got.
Thank you. Council reports. Start with Ms. Gabriel.
Thanks. I don't have anything.
I don't have anything either.
I'm doing great, sir.
I'm good.
Yeah, I just have one item. What? Okay. Yeah, I 2 things. One, just recently learned that former council member and longtime community involved person Jim Atkinson has recently passed away. So my condolences to his family and friends. He was a prominent member of the community, very much involved, had a big impact on the community, and we'll miss him. City owes a lot to him and his involvement in the community. Second item, so last year during the campaign, I heard a lot from the community about just organizations wanting to be able to present to the city council maybe longer comments and discussions than is allowed under public comment, and ability to have dialogue and conversations. And so I was thinking we might, with agendas, with the council's approval, in addition to having committee reports, have committee and community reports. This would be open to community organizations or groups that might want to give a presentation to city council. It would be invite only or approval by council only. Allow them to give a presentation, maybe give a PowerPoint presentation a little bit longer than your typical public comment, and allow for dialogue that we don't typically get with public comment. It'd be something that'd be scheduled and put on the agenda for the public to see. But get feedback on that approach to.
I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about that. I just, I want to make sure that we're not being seen as biased in any way, right? Everybody should have this opportunity. And obviously, we probably couldn't handle more than one a session, right? Just because it'll eat up some time. But I just want to make sure that, if we do this, that we make sure that everybody feels like they have a fair shot at that slot, right? And I know there's a lot of interest. Another possibility we could do is just a special night where we could publicly announce that, hey, the council's going to get together and we're going to talk to some nonprofits and just invite them in. That way, it's not going to preclude anybody from giving public comment if they have to wait for the extra 15, 20 minutes or whatever. Something to think about. I don't know what the right answer is. I'm just throwing out my concerns.
Okay. Thank you. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.